Judge Edward Matthews sat behind his polished oak desk, a firm hand resting on a stack of case files, his gaze scanning the courtroom as the morning session began. It was a typical Tuesday filled with the usual assortment of minor violations, speeding tickets, parking fines, and traffic infractions, the mundane ebb and flow of the law. He had presided over cases like these for years, and nothing ever seemed to change. Each defendant was another name in his ledger, and he had become adept at dispensing quick judgments and issuing fines without much thought. He believed in order and fairness in the system, but over time had grown detached from the real human stories behind each case. Today would prove different, but Matthews didn't know that yet. The first case of the day was a routine one, a traffic violation. A woman had been cited for running a red light at a busy intersection during rush hour. Matthews glanced at the docket and sighed. It was just another small case, another person in a hurry who had made a mistake and needed to pay the price. Nothing that would take much time. He glanced up from the papers and saw the woman enter the courtroom. She stood tall in a sharp black suit, her posture perfect, her confidence clear. But there was something in the way she moved that made Matthews pause. He noted her composed presence, the way she walked with the quiet authority of someone who was used to being respected, yet he quickly dismissed it, assuming she was just another person trying to avoid paying a fine. Vanessa Carter stepped into the courtroom with the kind of calm that comes from years of navigating rooms like these. She was used to scrutiny and judgment, but today felt different. There was something in the air, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Perhaps it was the look in the judge's eyes, or the way he had glanced at her as she entered. Vanessa had dealt with more than her fair share of biases in her life. But today she wasn't just a woman standing before a judge. Today she was a congresswoman, and that title carried weight. But she didn't wear it like armor. She wore it like a responsibility. She wasn't here to demand special treatment, but to ensure that she was treated fairly, just like anyone else. Matthews cleared his throat and motioned for her to approach the bench. Vanessa did so, with calm steps, placing the necessary documents in front of him. She explained briefly that she hadn't seen the light change and was on her way to an important meeting, something she knew was not an excuse, but she felt it was worth mentioning. Her words were precise, measured, but Matthews only half listened as he looked down at the citation, already prepared to move on with the proceedings. He was unmoved by her explanation, thinking it to be nothing more than a typical excuse. She spoke with grace, but it didn't matter. He would do what he had done countless times before, issue the fine and move on with his day. He didn't expect anything more from her, but something about her presence lingered in his mind, even as he began his lecture about the importance of obeying the law. Vanessa stood before the judge, maintaining her composure as Matthews began to speak in his usual stern tone. He lectured her about the importance of following traffic laws and respecting the system. His words felt rehearsed, as though he had delivered the same speech countless times before. "The law is the law, Ms. Carter," he said, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "No one is above it, not even those who claim to be in a rush. Running a red light is a danger to everyone on the road." He paused briefly, his eyes fixed on her with a sense of authority. "Your explanation might be valid, but it doesn't change the fact that you violated the law." Vanessa listened quietly, her expression never wavering. She knew what was coming. She had heard these kinds of speeches before. People had always assumed that because of her success, her status, she was exempt from facing the same consequences as everyone else. But she wasn't here to plead for leniency. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She simply wanted to be heard and treated fairly, just like anyone else in the courtroom. She opened her mouth to speak, but Matthews cut her off before she could get a word in. "I'm not here to listen to excuses," he said, his tone sharpening. "You should have planned your time better. You should have been more careful." Vanessa's jaw tightened at his dismissive tone, but she remained calm. She had learned long ago that reacting to such provocation only added fuel to the fire. "You're right, Judge," she said finally, her voice steady. "But my responsibility doesn't stop at the law. I represent people who rely on me, and sometimes that means balancing my time in ways that might not always be perfect. I understand the importance of rules, but I also believe in empathy." Matthews gave her a curt nod, but didn't seem to hear her. His focus was on the fine he was about to impose. "Empathy won't change the facts of the case," he said, adjusting his glasses as he scribbled something on the form. Running a red light is an offense, and you will pay the fine. The room fell silent, the tension palpable as everyone waited for the judge's next words. Vanessa stood her ground, her heart pounding, but she refused to show any sign of frustration. She knew the system all too well, but that didn't mean she would let this moment pass without standing up for herself and the values she believed in. Matthews slammed his gavel down with a force that seemed out of place for such a minor violation. I hereby fine you $250 for the violation. Next case, he called, dismissing her with a single motion of his hand. The sharp sound of the gavel echoed in the room as Vanessa remained rooted to the spot, the weight of the fine settling over her like a cold shadow. She felt her pulse quicken, not from anger but from something deeper. A sense of disbelief at how quickly the judge had assumed her guilt without even trying to understand the situation. It wasn't about the money, it was about how he had treated her. She had seen this before in countless situations where people judged her based on their biases and assumptions. The way he had dismissed her without hearing her story, without considering her position as a public servant, was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Vanessa turned to leave, her back straight and her head high. As she stepped out of the courtroom, she heard the murmur of the audience behind her, but she didn't look back. Matthews might have won this round, but this wasn't over. She was determined to make sure her voice, and the voices of countless others, would be heard. As Vanessa walked out of the courtroom, her steps were measured, but inside, she felt a surge of anger rising, quickly tempered by the calm she had learned to cultivate over the years. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, but she refused to let it rattle her. She had been through much worse in her life than the heavy-handed judgment of a small-town judge. Still, something about today felt different. This time, it wasn't just a matter of a fine. It was the realization that, even in her position of power, people still saw her through the lens of their own assumptions, and that hurt more than the $250 fine ever could. She reached the door and stepped out into the hallway, where the bustle of courthouse employees and defendants going about their business seemed far away compared to the tension she felt. The sharp sound of footsteps behind her broke her thoughts. She turned and found the judge's assistant, a young man, approaching with urgency. "Congresswoman Carter, wait, please," he called softly as he caught up to her. His voice seemed to tremble a little. Vanessa paused, surprised by his sudden interest. "Yes," she replied, turning slightly toward him. She didn't expect anyone to follow her outside, least of all someone from the judge's office. The assistant hesitated for a moment, then lowered his voice. "Judge Matthews, he didn't know who you were," he said, looking around as if worried someone might overhear. He didn't realize you're a member of Congress." Vanessa's brow furrowed slightly. "I see," she said slowly, her voice steady. She hadn't expected this, but something about it felt oddly familiar. The assumption that she was just another person in the system, a nameless face in the crowd, was a theme that had followed her for much of her life. But the fact that the judge had failed to recognize her was another level of disquieting. She had worked so hard to get to where she was, and yet, in the eyes of the law, she was still just another black woman to be overlooked. The assistant continued, now a bit more flustered. "I don't know how it happened. He just didn't recognize you. When I told him who you were, he was shocked. He asked if he should recall you, but you were already out the door." Vanessa was silent for a moment, processing the information. She wasn't surprised that Matthews hadn't recognized her, though it was a little disconcerting. The reality was that her identity wasn't the first thing people saw when they looked at her. They saw a black woman, not a congresswoman. It was the reality of existing in a world that judged her based on her skin, her gender, and the stereotypes they held about people like her. She had fought to be seen as more than those labels, but it didn't mean the world had caught up with her. "No," Vanessa finally said, her voice calm. "Don't worry about it. It's not your fault." She turned to leave, but then stopped, looking over her shoulder at the assistant. "But I'll tell you this," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I don't need to be recognized as a congresswoman to deserve fairness. We all do. Everyone in that courtroom deserves to be treated with respect, not just the ones who have a title." The assistant nodded, his eyes wide with understanding. Vanessa smiled, not in amusement, but with the quiet confidence she had spent years cultivating. Tell the judge, I'll be back. And next time, I hope he listens. With that, she turned and walked out of the courthouse, her mind already racing with the implications of what had just happened. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about the fine or the judge's ignorance. It was a glaring reminder of the systemic issues that plagued the justice system. People like Matthews, those in power, needed to see how their assumptions shaped their decisions. She wasn't sure what she would do next, but one thing was clear. This moment would not be wasted. She would make sure of that. As Vanessa stepped out of the courthouse and into the cool air of the afternoon, her mind raced. She had faced ignorance and bias before, but something about the incident today felt heavier. It wasn't just the judge's failure to recognize her. After all, she had grown used to people underestimating her based on her race, gender, and the way she carried herself. It was the speed at which Matthews had dismissed her, the certainty with which he had imposed a fine, assuming that her explanation was just another excuse. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a glimpse into the broader issue of how people in power often viewed those without it. Her phone buzzed in her purse, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from her assistant, Sophia, reminding her about a late afternoon briefing with her colleagues in Congress. Vanessa sighed, adjusting her jacket as she dialed the number. "Hey, Sophia," she said, trying to focus on the task ahead. "I'll be a few minutes late. Got held up at the courthouse." Sophia's voice crackled on the other end. "Is everything okay? You don't sound like yourself." Vanessa hesitated for a moment. She wasn't one to burden anyone with her frustrations, especially not her staff, but something about today had unsettled her in a way it was hard to shake. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice steady. "Just dealing with a bit of injustice, I guess." Sophia didn't press her further, but Vanessa knew her assistant well enough to sense the worry in her silence. She ended the call, her steps purposeful, as she made her way to her car. She couldn't let this moment linger. Too much was at stake. The fine itself was a small matter. What mattered now was how her experience highlighted the deeper flaws in the justice system, flaws that affected not just her, but countless others who didn't have the privilege of a platform to speak out. As she drove, her thoughts continued to churn. There was something else, something about Matthew's demeanor that had bothered her. The way he had spoken so condescendingly, the way his eyes had flicked to her with an air of disapproval, even before he had heard her explanation. She had seen this before in other places, in other faces. People who didn't think she belonged, who assumed she wasn't enough. It wasn't just about race or status. It was about power. And in his courtroom, Matthews held the power. Vanessa's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She wasn't about to let this go. That night, as she sat in her office reviewing documents for an upcoming bill on judicial reform, she couldn't shake the image of Judge Matthews' stern face from her mind. The way he had dismissed her with such certainty. It was clear to her that his judgment wasn't just about the law. It was about something deeper, something that had been ingrained in the system for generations. It was about the belief that some people were less deserving of fairness, less worthy of respect. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from her press secretary. "Congresswoman," the voice on the other end said, "the story's already gaining traction. News outlets are picking up the details of your encounter with Judge Matthews." Vanessa didn't respond immediately, her thoughts still on the judge and his blatant bias. "I need to make a statement," she said finally, her voice clear and unwavering. "We need to address this. It's time people saw the truth for what it is." The call ended, and she sat back in her chair, staring out the window as the weight of the day settled on her shoulders. She had always believed that her role in Congress was about more than just laws and policy. It was about making the system work for everyone, especially those who had been overlooked and oppressed for far too long. Tomorrow, she would do more than just speak out. She would take action. The next morning, Vanessa stood before the cameras, her expression resolute as the press gathered around her. Word of her encounter with Judge Matthews had spread quickly, and the media was eager to hear what she would say about it. She had prepared herself for this moment, no longer just a conversation about a traffic fine, but a chance to speak on the larger issues of race, bias, and the need for reform in the judicial system. A reporter from a major news outlet was the first to ask, "Congresswoman Carter, can you walk us through what happened at the courthouse yesterday? Many are wondering why you didn't receive a fair hearing from the judge." Vanessa took a deep breath, her eyes scanning a crowd. She had done this many times before, spoken truth to power, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. But this was different. This was personal, in a way that few things had been. What happened yesterday was not just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a deeper issue in our justice system, she began, her voice steady but passionate. The judge didn't see me for who I am. He saw a black woman in front of him, and in that moment, I became just another person to be dismissed. It wasn't about the fine or the ticket. It was about the way people in power often make assumptions about those who don't look like them. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd of reporters. Vanessa continued, "I've spent my entire life fighting for justice, but this isn't just about me. It's about all the people who walk into courtrooms every day and face that same bias. People who don't have the platform I do. People whose stories are dismissed before they're even heard." A reporter raised her hand, and Vanessa nodded for her to speak. "You mentioned bias, Congresswoman. How do you think we can address this issue on a larger scale? Do you believe the justice system needs reform?" Vanessa's answer was immediate. Absolutely. The justice system is broken, and it disproportionately affects people of color. We need more than just a few policy changes. We need to confront the biases that are built into the system. That means judicial reform, starting with training for judges and other legal professionals to recognize and address their biases. It means holding those in positions of power accountable when they fail to deliver fair and equal treatment. Her words hung in the air, drawing the attention of the media and the public. This wasn't just about one man's mistake. It was about the systemic flaws that had been festering for years. It was about a much-needed reckoning in the world of justice. Another reporter spoke up. "Do you think Judge Matthews should be held accountable for what happened?" Vanessa paused for a moment before responding. "I believe accountability is essential, but it's not just about one person. It's about the culture within the system. If we only focus on one mistake, we miss the bigger picture. That said, I do believe Judge Matthews needs to reflect on his actions. We can't have individuals in positions of power who are blind to their own biases." The press conference continued, but Vanessa's words resonated long after it ended. As the reporters filed out of the room, she sat down at her desk, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about bringing attention to her own experience. It was about starting a conversation that could lead to real change. Her phone buzzed once more, this time with a message from her chief of staff, Michael. "The press is blowing up. We've already received calls from multiple organizations interested in collaborating on a judicial reform initiative. The momentum is building." Vanessa smiled to herself. This was only the beginning. She knew that true change wouldn't happen overnight, but with each conversation, with each person who understood the issue, she was moving closer to her goal. The fight wasn't just hers. It was for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or mistreated by a system that was supposed to protect them. And with her platform, she would make sure that their voices would be heard. In the days that followed Vanessa's press conference, the media buzzed with coverage of her statements, and the conversation surrounding judicial reform grew louder. Articles were written, op-eds were published, and politicians on both sides of the aisle weighed in on the issue. Vanessa knew that this momentum was fleeting. News cycles moved quickly, and if she didn't act fast, the issue could fade away, replaced by the next scandal or hot topic. She couldn't afford that. She had to seize this moment. Her office became a war room of sorts. Phone calls were made, meetings were scheduled, and strategy sessions filled her days. Her staff was rallying behind her, and it was clear that this issue had struck a nerve. Advocates for racial justice, civil rights organizations, and even some unlikely allies from within the judicial community had reached out to offer support. People were listening, and now it was time to turn that attention into action. Vanessa sat at her desk one afternoon, reviewing the proposed legislative framework for judicial reform her team had put together. It was a comprehensive plan, one that would mandate bias training for judges and lawyers, provide resources for public defenders, and implement measures to increase accountability within the courts. But she knew it was going to be an uphill battle. There were powerful interests entrenched in the system who would resist any change. But if she was being honest with herself, resistance didn't intimidate her. She had been fighting against the odds her entire career. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from her colleague in Congress, Representative Mark Jensen, a seasoned lawmaker with years of experience in the Judiciary Committee. "Vanessa," he said when she picked up, his voice measured but friendly. "I've been following everything and I want to help. But I'm going to be blunt with you. Getting judicial reform through Congress is going to be one of the hardest things you've ever done. It's going to take allies, strategy, and a whole lot of patience." Vanessa smiled, though she could hear the gravity in his tone. "I didn't expect it to be easy, Mark. But I didn't get here by taking the easy path. The system is broken, and we both know it." "That's true," Mark agreed. "But reforming the system from the inside is a tricky business. A lot of people are going to fight you every step of the way. You're going to have to deal with pushback from your own colleagues. Some of them aren't going to be willing to rock the boat." "I've dealt with resistance before," Vanessa said, her voice unwavering. "I'm not backing down. The people who are affected by these biases don't have the luxury of waiting for reform. They live with the consequences every single day." Mark chuckled softly, clearly impressed with her determination. "I like that fire. I'll help however I can. Let's talk strategy soon." "Okay." Vanessa hung up the phone, her thoughts shifting back to the battle ahead. The first step was ensuring that her bill was introduced with enough support to force a serious debate. She wasn't naive. She knew the political landscape could be hostile to such reforms, especially given the entrenched interests of law enforcement agencies and judicial advocates who benefited from the status quo. But she was resolute. This fight was bigger than any one person, any one politician. This was about ensuring that people like her, Black women, people of color, marginalized communities, were given the fair treatment they deserved in the justice system. As the days turned into weeks, Vanessa's team worked tirelessly. She met with allies from both sides of the aisle, pushed for public hearings on judicial reform, and continued speaking out in the media. Her voice was gaining traction, and the pressure on Congress to address these issues was mounting. But the political landscape, as Mark had warned her, was far from easy. A significant block of conservative lawmakers dug in their heels, arguing that judicial independence was paramount and that reforms would undermine the system. They painted her proposals as divisive and unnecessary, claiming that the system worked fine for most people and only a few isolated incidents warranted reform. Yet Vanessa remained undeterred. She knew that real change came not from appeasing the powerful, but from challenging the status quo and demanding accountability. She had faced adversity before. This was no different, and as long as her voice and the voices of those who had been silenced continued to rise, the battle would continue. She wasn't about to let the issue die quietly. She was going to fight until the system finally reflected the justice it was meant to deliver. Weeks passed, and the pressure on Vanessa to deliver results only grew. Her judicial reform bill, now known as the Fair Justice Reform Act, had made it to the House floor. But the road to securing passage was proving to be more complicated than she had anticipated. The bill had gathered a lot of attention, some positive, some hostile, but it was becoming clear that the opposition wasn't going to back down without a fight. Vanessa knew the political landscape was divided, but the intensity of the resistance caught her off guard. Powerful lobbying groups representing law enforcement and judicial associations began to flood Capitol Hill with phone calls, emails, and op-eds. The arguments against her bill were predictable. They claimed it would erode judicial independence, undermine the integrity of the courts, and disrupt the delicate balance of power that had served the country for centuries. It wasn't just the usual opponents. Some of her colleagues on both sides of the aisle had begun to publicly distance themselves from the bill, citing concerns over its potential to spark division. In her office, Vanessa sat surrounded by a small team of aides, reviewing the latest reports. The weight of the situation felt heavy, but she wasn't ready to give up, not when so many people were counting on her. She glanced at the list of names on her desk, key lawmakers she would need to sway if she wanted to pass the bill. It was going to take a combination of negotiation, persuasion, and pressure. "We've got to get creative," Vanessa said, breaking the silence in the room. "I know we have the moral high ground on this, but we need more than just good intentions. We need strategy." Her chief of staff, Michael, looked up from the pile of documents in front of him. "You're right, Congresswoman. We can't just keep hammering on the same points. We need to find common ground. I've been talking to some of the more moderate members, people who may not be fully on board, but are open to discussing reforms that address both accountability and fairness. We could push for smaller, incremental changes in the bill to gain some support." Vanessa fought for a moment. She had always believed in big-picture solutions, but Michael's suggestion made sense. If they could get a few moderate Republicans and conservative Democrats on board by offering compromise provisions, it could provide the momentum needed to move the bill forward. The hard part was balancing those compromises with the integrity of the original reforms. She couldn't afford to water down the bill too much. "I'll talk to the Progressive Caucus," Vanessa decided, her voice firm. "If we push too hard for incremental changes, we risk losing the momentum we've already built. We need to find a balance. Let's meet with our allies in the media, too. We need the public on our side." A few days later, as Vanessa prepared for a series of back-to-back meetings with key members of Congress, the phone rang in her office. It was Sophia, her assistant, with a quick update. "Congresswoman, there's been a breakthrough," Sophia said, her voice excited. "One of the most influential Republican senators, Senator Langford, has come out in support of your bill. He's going to endorse it publicly tomorrow. This could be the turning point we need." Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. Senator Langford had long been known for his tough stance on law and order. If he was on board, it could help persuade many other Republicans to follow suit. "That's great news," Vanessa said, feeling a flicker of hope. "But we can't rest on our laurels. We need to make sure we're keeping the pressure on, especially with those who are still undecided. We can't lose momentum now." As the days wore on, things began to shift in her favor. Senator Langford's public endorsement of the Fair Justice Reform Act gave the bill a new level of credibility, especially among Republicans. Meanwhile, Vanessa's team worked tirelessly behind the scenes to negotiate with fence-sitters, offering compromises where necessary but refusing to let the core principles of the bill be diluted. The legislative battle was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, Vanessa allowed herself a brief moment of optimism. This wasn't just about a single piece of legislation. It was about the future of the justice system, about whether people, regardless of their background, race, or gender, could trust the system to treat them fairly. And with every step, she was moving closer to ensuring that the people who had been systematically overlooked would finally have their voices heard. But even as she celebrated the small victories, she knew this fight was far from won. The real challenge was just beginning. The final stretch of the battle for the Fair Justice Reform Act was upon Vanessa, and though the road had been long, the weight of the task at hand never seemed heavier. The weeks of strategizing, negotiating, and fighting back against opposition had brought her to this pivotal moment. The bill was inching closer to a vote in the House, and despite the support from some unexpected allies, including Senator Langford, there were still powerful voices pushing back hard against her reforms. They would stop at nothing to derail the progress she had made, determined to preserve the status quo. Vanessa sat in her office late one evening, reviewing the latest developments. The media had continued to report on the bill, with opinions split down party lines. Some praised her efforts as an essential step toward ending the biases in the justice system, while others denounced it as an overreach that threatened the integrity of the courts. The pressure was mounting, but Vanessa had made a promise to herself that she wouldn't back down, not when so many were counting on her. She looked up as Michael entered the room, his expression serious. "The vote's scheduled for tomorrow. I've talked to as many undecided members as I could, but we're still facing stiff opposition from some key Republicans. There's a chance this might not pass, Vanessa." Vanessa's gaze remained steady, her face calm but her mind sharp. "We've known this wouldn't be easy. The question is, How can we push them over the line? How do we make sure this passes? Michael nodded, pacing slightly. We've got to keep the pressure on. I've been working with the communications team to keep the public engaged. If we can show that the majority of people support reform, it might help sway the last few holdouts. The more people speak out, the harder it will be for them to ignore. Vanessa didn't hesitate. Let's make sure we get those voices heard. I'll be on the floor tomorrow, making the case one last time. The next day, as the vote drew near, Vanessa stood before a crowded room of lawmakers, the tension palpable. The debate was fierce, with passionate arguments on both sides. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she was resolute. This wasn't just a political maneuver. It was about the people whose voices had been ignored for far too long. It was about the individuals who had faced the brunt of a broken system, and about ensuring that the country lived up to its ideals of justice for all. When it was her turn to speak, Vanessa stood tall, her voice unwavering. What we are discussing today is more than just a bill. It's a question of whether we want to continue allowing our justice system to be built on assumptions and biases, or whether we want to create a system that truly works for everyone. I stand here today not just as a member of Congress, but as a Black woman who has experienced firsthand the ways in which the system fails. This bill is about fairness, accountability, and ensuring that every person, regardless of their race, gender, or background, has the right to be treated with dignity and respect in our courts. Her words echoed through the chamber, and for a brief moment, the room was silent. Vanessa knew she had made an impact. Whether it was enough remained to be seen. When the vote came, the results were close, but the Fair Justice Reform Act passed. The room erupted in applause from her supporters, but Vanessa didn't celebrate. Not yet. She was proud, yes, but the fight wasn't over. This was only the first step toward the deeper structural changes needed in the system. She knew this wasn't the end, but a significant turning point in her long journey for justice. In the days following the vote, Vanessa received messages of congratulations from allies and supporters. But the most meaningful ones came from the people she had worked for, the individuals who had faced injustice and would finally see some small measure of fairness in the system. These messages reminded her why she had started this journey in the first place. As she sat at her desk, reviewing the final language of the bill before it was signed into law, Vanessa allowed herself a moment to reflect. She had faced countless obstacles, but she had remained committed to her goal, to create a justice system that treated all people equally. The victory was hard-earned, but it was one that would echo for years to come. And though there would be more battles ahead, Vanessa knew that her fight for justice was far from over. This was just the beginning.